Ask you to think of maybe 10 instruments that you feel, electric instruments that you feel were important, significant.
Mm.
What sort of things might you include in the list?
Mm. Uh, I suppose I'd start with the Cahill Telharmonium or dynamophone, 1896. There were electrical instruments prior to that, but they were generally proofs of electrical principles and so forth. The Telharmonium was a real instrument. It weighed 200 tons or thereabouts, packed up on 10 rail cars and taken to New York City where they tried to do music. The reason it would be important is it's the progenitor of the Hammond organ, first of all. It uses rotating tone wheels, but no amplifiers. You don't have amplifiers until 1915 when H.D. Arnold and others at Bell Labs improved on Lee Forrest's basic amplifier design. So the telharmonium was extremely important because uh, of the hugeness of the endeavor, the fact that it was a prototype of the Hammond organ, and that it was an attempt to use electrical means and to disseminate the music widely. It was not a closet kind of a thing. It was a big, millions of dollars in today's dollars. It was the victim of a variety of problems. I suppose it'd be quite a long time. Well, not a long time, really. After the telharmonium is an instrument totally unlike the telharmonium, the theremin. Extremely important. Uh, if you've ever played with an old radio and put your hands up near it, it whistles and carries on. It's sensing your body capacitance. This is what a theremin does. When you put your hand into the field of this antenna over here for pitch and this one over here for loudness, it literally senses your body capacitance and changes the values of components inside and makes this difference tone, as it's called, that you hear and the loudness that you hear. Very important because, as Bob Moog said, the most novel and difficult playing interface of all time. From here to here can be 5 octaves, and where the heck is C sharp 3? Bang, right there. Very difficult to play, and therefore not many people have played it well. It's important because of all the early instruments, it was least like an orchestral instrument. You have all manner of instruments in there with all crazy names and some important ones. It was least like orchestral, very unusual way of playing. And of course, then it permeated movies for years and years and is still there. In Mars Attacks, you've got this score that quotes theremin. It has sample theremin, real theremin, Howard Shore theremin, and On Martineau score for oh goodness, what is it? Well, anyhow, coming up out of the casket, it's a spoof on horror films. Uh, yeah, so that was an important instrument. About 10 years after that, that's 1919 or so. Then you got the Martineau from Maurice Martineau, played by his sister Jeanette, which eventually was taught at the Paris Conservatory as a regular instrument. Because it has probably the largest body of works for it, it's extremely important as an instrument. It has 400 or 500 works. This is not many instruments that are electronic do. That's one of the ways it's broken with the past. You don't have a standard literature that you learn to play on the Moog synthesizer. There's no such thing. What would be next? Oh, I suppose the Hammond organ, 1935. Why? Well, it's a modernization. Became a very uh, attractive instrument to many people, especially in pop music. It was put into churches. It was meant to be like a pipe organ to begin with. There was even a big Federal Trade Commission suit about the Hammond organ calling it an organ. The pipe organ people didn't want that. Anyhow, that would be right up there, with the important instruments. Possibly the Nova chord from that same era from the Hammond Company, 1939 into the 60s even, being played on albums, film scores, all manner of things. A polyphonic vacuum tube organ, but with synthesizer-like ideas. Uh, I'm sort of thinking of instruments now, and then we could just go through synthesizers. So uh, after the Hammond, what? A lot of fairly indistinguished home organs that, from a historical standpoint, I'm sure they had firsts and things like that. Not something I'm real familiar with, nor much that I care about. More interested in what impacted music in the outside world, not playing in the home kind of thing. Certainly, the Moog synthesizer has to become extremely important. Before it, Hewlett Kane's electronic Sagbot, one of a kind, not an archetype of what Bob Moog did, but a prototype, elements of voltage control. Although I don't think that warrants saying that Hewlett Kane invented the synthesizer or voltage control. Bob Moog didn't invent voltage control. It was something that people did with odd things. He applied it to musical instruments and systematized it and published it, proselytized, so forth, made it work in the marketplace. So the Moog would be extremely important in that context. Then it would be hard to peg exactly. Well, I suppose that Bell Labs' Hal Alice's instrument, which was an additive synthesizer, in fact, if you look at the patent specification, was capable of sampling and might have been one of the very early samplers. It's hard to say exactly who did what. You might throw the Mellotron in there in its era prior to digital sampling as a forerunner of that idea. Certainly, sampling is an extremely important idea, and the Mellotron probably had more impact than a lot of other things. Uh, I really like the Chapman stick in the modern era as being an important instrument. It has not reached its full potential, in my view, for a variety of reasons. For one thing, it requires people who know how to play one instrument to stretch a little bit to play. If you have to start all over, you're more likely to get people than to, take guitar players and bass players and get them to stretch a little bit. Like the intervals in the bass part of the stick are not in fourths as they are on a bass, they're in fifths. So it's like a totally different world. Psychologists call what happens when you have slightly different changes and too much similar like the other as creating something called cognitive dissonance. If you just started from scratch, you'd probably be okay. But I think the stick is brilliant in its design and execution. And I think Emmett Chapman, its designer, has not allowed it to be built by some company that would put it into plastic or something. And there's that factor too. It has tremendous integrity. It's grown at its own pace and so forth. Uh, hmm. You've seen one synthesizer, you've seen them all. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, there's this museum, a German museum, that has a couple of CDs out with all these different analog synthesizers. You heard one sawtooth, you've heard another, not literally. In the old days, you could always tell an ARP from a Moog, and Buchla was like a totally different sound world. Just by ear, you could do that. People that were familiar. Nowadays, not so much. It's pretty homogenized. Uh, hmm. Who are some of the people that would be in the Hall of Fame, as it were, from the digital side? Certainly Max Matthews at Bell Labs with the development, and I'm getting a little out of order here, and the development of computer music, direct digital synthesis. I do not consider that to be the progenitor of the market for synthesizers. I think that comes with Bob Moog and Al Pearlman and Dave Smith and Tommy Oberheim, and I hope I'm who are the people that started all those little companies to begin with. Peter Zinoviev and a variety of people doing that in different countries. So my personal interest, because of being a wind player, would put Niles Steiner in a posture, having developed the electronic valve instrument and then the EWI, the electronic woodwind instrument, as an important figure. But I don't think, I'm not even sure that his fame will happen in his lifetime because of the sluggishness of the market to recognize that things that play one note are usually more expressive than things that play multiple notes. It's just degrees of freedom. again. I don't know. What have I left out? You have a whole variety of
Chowning and the FM.
FM really is an offshoot of Max Matthews. John Chowning discovered FM. He didn't develop it. He did. He helped develop it, but by his own story, he tried to do a vibrato and it happened too fast, and he got back and it was an interesting texture. And he took it to some engineers and said, "What the heck is going? Oh, those are sidebands, John. That's FM. But what the heck are you doing? You're listening to the carrier. That's ha 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 ha. In radio, the carrier is way up in the megahertz range. You can't hear it." And he had sort of blundered, frankly, into it, which he sort of says it that way. Very important in terms of instruments. And then, of course, the DX7 was enormously important. One of the best-selling synthesizers of all times. The Ensoniq Mirage, as that came along, that was another end of the marketplace, very important, even though it was only like 8-bit sampling and things like that. The Kurzweil 250 then as a flagship of the digital era and things like that. But I get much less interested in the also rans. It's once you have Moog and ARP and Buchla and a few people and who made contributions, but it's okay, then everybody started building them. You had all kinds of people building analog voltage control. Then you had all kinds of people building samplers. The real question, I think, is what happened that touched the market in some sort of big way, got the attention, said, "Hey, you," to musicians and things like that. A lot of those instruments did. The Telharmonium failed. The Hammond was very successful. The Telharmonium was ahead of its time. Again, the technology, the aesthetics, the industry, those elements that you have to have, sort of like having Jupiter and Mars aligned. If the stars are right, then your instrument, my son, may become an impact in the marketplace. If they're not aligned properly, and I don't think anybody but that fellow I was talking about, Aitken, who had done the series on radio, has talked about this sufficiently. Or I don't know about the books if they have. But I think it's extremely important. So it's kind of a rundown. Synthesizers, maybe being a different idea, even though I mentioned the Moog, it was a performance instrument. The idea of a thing that you can make the entire texture of a musical production with date from about 1929 with instruments in Paris that had a 4-note capacity and a paper tape reader, looked an awful lot like the RCA, which had a paper tape reader. The Hannert Orchestra before that in 45 had a paper tape reader, except the reader rolled over the tape. It was a 55-foot long table with cards on it, the graphite markings and improbable stuff. Again, the technology wasn't viable to move into the market with it at that point. So yes, the RCA, because Milton Babbitt and a whole group of people at Columbia Princeton utilized it in the way it should be utilized for avant-garde music. They tried to do pop tunes. It was laughable. So Olson and Ballard had done a wonderful development of the RCA. And then you have things like the Kima and on up into that idea that you're really not going to play this thing live. You're going to use it as a basis. MIDI, as much as I don't like MIDI, for the reasons I've articulated, I need to write a small book, is an important development. It's almost like a dog that walks on its hind legs. You don't critique, you applaud. The very fact that the industry could get together well enough to have something that was the subject of an agreement, it hasn't happened much since then, frankly. Or as I'm fond of saying, the wonderful thing about standards and protocols is there's so many of them. Look at what we got now, Blu-ray and HD DVD. The same sad story as beta and VHS when tape. And on and on and on. 45s versus 33 1/3. Over and over the industry has been shown you'd be a lot better off just getting past the format wars and everybody start to make some money and everything. It'd be better off. Like, how many people really have one of those high definition players now? Not many. They're expensive. Why are they expensive? people like me are hanging back. I don't want to buy another thing, which I have many of, that's now superseded. So it's strange. So synthesizers are kind of like the non-performance area of the thing, the studio aspect, the non-real time is one stream and the performance things are another stream. Synthesizers came out of instruments like the theremin and stuff like that in a very distant past. Not in their design, but in their thrust. People are going to play these. Okay, fine. People are going to program these. Okay, fine. Now we have this dichotomy. And it was stuck there. And this was recognized at the Cologne studio. One of the principals there wrote a tract and said, well, gee, it'd be awful nice if you could play this Trautonium-like instrument, this instrument that Friedrich Trautwein had there, or the mellochord, as well as do all the tape manipulation and everything. But that pretty much fell by the wayside for aesthetic reasons. And interestingly, the Cologne studio, a lot of people have never really just thought about it very much. They were not really that interested in exploring the vast new textural world of electronic music. That's not where they came from. Pierre Schaeffer was more like that in Paris. Stockhausen in particular, and Eimert, and to a certain extent some of the others, were more interested in exploring dodecaphonic music. In other words, we've gotten to the limit of what an orchestra can do. If we want to serialize everything, including rhythm and dynamics, and you're just not likely to spread this amongst the orchestra and get it to come back out in any reasonable sort of way. So what do you turn to? You turn to a mechanistic way of doing it, to a programmed way of doing it. And the proof of that pudding is very simple. What did they call the publication, the house organ, if you will, of the Cologne Electronic Music Studio? De Rhea, the row. They didn't call it electroacoustic music or whatnot. They called it the row. And in particular, in the early days, they were interested in sine waves. Very pure, very much oriented toward that cognitive world of 12-tone music. Yeah, they were extending dodecaphonic music. They were not necessarily exploring that sound world of electroacoustic music. That changed quickly. People began to realize, well, you can do either. You don't have to do either musique concrète or electronic music, which there was this antipathy, naturally.
Yeah. So the row was specifically talking about 12-tone.
It talked a lot about 12-tone stuff, but it also talked about electronic means and, how they were doing what they were doing and informative articles. And there were, of course, these composer symposia at Darmstadt and places like that. And Donaueschingen before then, I guess I'm saying those approximately correctly. I'm an American. I don't have to worry about European pronunciations. Hugh Davies. As I mentioned before, the first clinician for Moog was Chris Swanson, and I think the first historian of any note for electroacoustic music was Hugh Davies. And of course, I knew Hugh, and we always kind of referred to each other as the other historian, And I was thinking that I appeared, I guess it was in 1991, at the Bourges Festival in France for electroacoustic music because Françoise Berrier and Christian Clousier, I don't know where they'd even heard me speak, but they felt like I was not chauvinistic as an American, and so why? I mean, a lot of this stuff happened in Germany and France and, England, and wherever it takes you, that's where you go. Anyway, I got some nice invitations and wound up at Bourges, and I hadn't seen Hugh in years since I'd first been to England, and he translated my entire lecture into French spontaneously. He was a marvelous guy. He did word-by-word translations in the Cyrillic, Russian, for God's sakes, to find out about ANS and crazy stuff in Russia and little-known things, and that was Hugh, and he was I sort of thought of myself as more of an outside guy talking to people out in the field and collecting data. And Hugh is an inside guy, in the library and just doggedly doing these incredible things. And of course, he wrote all those wonderful articles in the New Grove Dictionary of Musical Instruments, in which he was so kind as to cite my work, in every case, even in places where I felt like, well, I didn't tell Hugh anything about that. He knew more than I did. Still, if I wrote anything about it, there would be the citation. Very kind. A good musician, a person who had ideas about improvisation and cogent ideas. He wrote a very interesting tract. Oh, and we went up on the train after Bourges through Paris, and then went out to Den Haag, where this museum had started some work that he had sort of propelled. This collection of instruments. They had a lot of very nice instruments, but they weren't being displayed real prominently. And I tried to prevail upon them to do that. The current director was kind of interested in big pieces that looked like art. Now, I was more interested, no, show everything you got, show as much of the story as you can. But they were kind of having a white wall period, let's put this Neo Beckstein over against this white wall. Let's put this Moog that they got, I think, from John Appleton up at Dartmouth, and let's put it over against this white wall, and it'll look like MoMA or the music, the Guggenheim or something. I don't know what was going on, and I really don't know where it's gone, particularly. But Hugh was instrumental in that. Had done a much better job than I'd been able to do, at least of getting some instruments together. Maybe the zeitgeist in Europe was a little more felicitous than it had always been in America. But Hugh was the kind of person that left so little footprint on the earth and gave so much, that of course he's sorely missed by me and many other people, I'm certain. Interesting too, an aside, Hugh is related tangentially. After that meeting again, in which we sort of refanned those flames of knowing each other. And he told me about this book where he talked about improvisation. It was like a chapter or something. He told me the name, obviously, and it stuck immediately. And I flew home and was there by myself in Europe. My wife was in the U.S. And when I got home, I told Muriel, I said, well, wow, I'm so wired, from doing all this the last 10 days and seeing you and meeting Otto Mensink was one of the people there at the museum, and a wonderful experience of seeing some of the things I dreamed about happening, instruments being shown in a museum. Wonderful. I said I'm not going to be able to go to sleep. Let's just go out to the Berkshires here in Massachusetts, and we did, totally kind of at random. And oh, while Hugh and I were at the museum in Netherlands, they showed me this wonderful color picture, sort of faded, of the New World Ensemble from Ferdy Grofé that had been at a little kiosk at the 1939 World's Fair in New York as part of the Ford building. 4 Nova chords and a Hammond organ with Ferdy Grofé, doing the honors and arrangements and stuff. Wonderful idea. Here's an ensemble in 1939 of electric instruments. Down on the Midway, by the way, Tom Adrian Craycraft had a different ensemble of Benjamin Franklin Meissner instruments, basically, mostly stringed instruments. That at the World's Fair, and basically, just there as a kind of a sideshow. Nobody thought much about it. Oh, yeah, that was weird stuff. So anyhow, I had those two things in my mind. The publication with Hugh, said very hard to find, and that photo. They subsequently sent me a huge poster that had been done professionally of that photo, which I now have. Wonderful. Came home very tired, very wired, went out, driving along, and saw a little sign, a little A-frame sign, book sale today. I said, oh, I've got 3,000 books or more, and, let's book sale, obviously. So we trucked up the little road, the book sale at some high school, paid $1 or $2, and walked in and turned immediately to the right and saw this stall. And I am not exaggerating. I walked over to the ephemera the paper material in this stall, which was books and ephemera, and did this and leaned forward and found in a plastic folder the brochure with the same picture on it that I'd just seen of the New World Ensemble with Ferdy Grofé. And I called Bureau and I said, look at this. And I told her the story. I said, they had this beautiful poster and so forth. And then I did this. I looked over here and reached up and pulled down Hugh's book. Okay. Now, Jung, the psychologist, wrote a wonderful book called Synchronicity, in which I believe a great deal of what can happen for us is because our antennae are out. We're in an intense mode. We're really paying attention, as my mother would say. Pay attention. Yeah, we're paying attention. And multitudinous objects that we didn't see before or hear before now are there, and we hear and see and so forth. I don't think it's just, 6 degrees of coincidence and so forth. I think when you're really vibrant and vibrating almost, that you get what I call a nexus. You find places where, oh, there's opportunity here. I know what to do. I'll do this. Like when I saw the Moog synthesizer and said, that's going someplace and I'm going to go there. That's going to be an interesting career. I'm going to go do that right now. It worked for me. But, just as an aside about Hugh, I was, so, excuse me, so stoked and wired having seen Hugh and Kindred Soul that I could talk about everything I could say. He would know exactly about it and tell me more than I knew. And an amazing guy, like a walking encyclopedia. And then back and bang, those two things, just right off the top. Here it is, pulled it out, wasn't much money, bought it, of course. It was given out at the World's Fair. Here's the other, oh, here it is right here. And I don't mean just looking. I mean, walked over, pulled this back, and there it was. Looked over here and pulled it down, and there it was. And so I try to get my students to understand that to have a life is to be turned on, to be excited about things, to want to do something, not to be dragged kicking and screaming. It's not the virtue of practice that means anything. It's the fact that you really enjoy that thing. You're not trying to get to be a better musician. You're practicing and you want to do that thing. And you do that thing. And then that end will come. All of the things to me that we work on, it's important to understand. And now there's brain studies, of course, that confirm this. The amygdala and all this business, that in a heightened emotional state, you will learn better, you will remember better. The analogy I give in class often is, how many people my age do not remember exactly what happened when John F. Kennedy was assassinated? Or in another generation, when the spaceship blew up right off the launch pad. How many people don't remember that? Nobody. Everybody remembers it. I know exactly what happened that day. I know what people's faces looked like. Why? Because it was such an intensely emotional experience that it instantly imprinted. And it made me realize guys like you or me, or Bob Moog, and the people that I loved to be around, that's the way they were. They were passionate people. And the coolness of this present generation and milieu that we seem to be in puts me off a good bit. And that passion is the experience of the life, not the kudos and the things that you attain. It's got to be something like that. I was, in my many travels demoing Moog synthesizers, I think it was Vienna, I couldn't swear to it. It seems that you could sit behind the orchestra even, and, it's a weird hall, a beautiful hall, but it looked like engraved in granite at one part of the hall, there was this Latin expression. It wasn't even German, it was Latin. And I knew a little Latin, so I was looking there absentmindedly trying to piece what it says until I finally got the gist of it. There is no joy except in seriousness. And wow, people that know me know I rarely draw a long face. I'm telling terrible jokes, cutting up, making a fool of myself because I don't care if people think I'm a fool. Uh, and yet, I am deadly serious about those things for which I develop a passion. Whether it's golf, which means nothing in my world. It's a good example. I go play golf with guys my age and they can't hit the ball at all. They look like they're, trying to tomahawk the ground. They've never looked at anybody and realized, oh, there's a very narrow window of things you can do to make this work pretty well. Balance, transfer, etc. And then I will hear them say, oh, we're just out here to have fun. And I'm thinking, there are many things that I don't need to do well. But if I decide I would like to do something reasonably well, it's fun to strive to do it well. Not to just say, I'm just out here and it's a park. I have to bring my lunch or something. And that's the way I've felt about electronic music and about the people I worked with. Dave Luce, Bob Moog, Jim Scott, my mentors from college, my trumpet teachers, and all that kind of thing. It was that passion that I found was extremely interesting. Which brings us to Bob, I guess.
Jim Scott first, please.
Okay, Jim Scott.
Yeah.
Jim Scott, big Jim Scott. 6'4", 6'5", hulking Jim Scott. Presently out teaching Navajo how to read. A true hippie who never gave it up. Sold his home, had a little trailer on the back of a truck, went out there and is doing good works. Doesn't care about the material world. When I met Jim, I saw pictures of him. He had come from, I think, San Francisco or someplace and been hired at the Moog Company and immediately set about doing all kinds of things. He had a hand in the development of the Mini Moog. He designed the Micro Moog, the Multi Moog, etc. I knew him when Dave Luce and I drove down to someplace in New York away from the Moog plant and interviewed him, not to vet whether he should be an engineer at Moog, but to sort of persuade him, hope that he would come. Jim was the kind of guy that he would work at night and then you'd find him asleep behind some of the stock, parts cabinets and so forth. There's Jim again. He fell asleep, and there he is now. It's noon and he's behind the parts cabinets and such. A true free spirit and a guy that impacted me greatly and made me realize a lot of things that were important and about instruments, expressions. Like he said, well, I build instruments from the outside in. The first thing Jim Scott would do if he were going to design an instrument is not sit down and start, drawing circuitry and even doing a breadboard or putting something together. No, he would draw the front panel. Boy, could I resonate with that. As time went on at the Moog Company and elsewhere, I told people, I said, manual writing, in point of fact, is the junction between this group of people over here and that group of people over there. And not being able to explain your product should tell you something. Therefore, you should have the manual writer there as the product is being designed. If this person has any sensitivity and understands this group over here of musicians, knows a little bit even about this technology over here and how it might or could work, then you don't get a phenomenon like, I remember sitting in meetings and engineers saying, well, the customer will just have to do so-and-so. And I said, no, the customer will just have to go buy our sequential circuits. Well, they're not a captive audience, guys. We can't say, well, we'll design it this way and they'll just have to conform and, twist themselves around and try to understand something that we did a bad job of. Because, see, I've been reading stuff about design, architecture, the Bauhaus, and I was into all of that for a while. And I was thinking of design as a thing, not just, we're designing an instrument here. It was like an idea. And Scott was that way. He would start from the outside in. And I would look at it and say, well, will they really understand this? Was this apparent? How does this work? A good front panel and good nomenclature, the names for everything and all that stuff, should assist the user. And even today, we don't have this as an ideal. People do virtual systems. They call things all kinds of stuff for Pete's sakes. And this is really awful. They'll know who they are. There's one outfit that has a virtual system, and they have noise. And over on this side of the knob is white, and over on this side of the knob, it's colored. Rather unfortunate connotations in the United States, particularly. In the English language, I think that's a little unfortunate. But you see, a lot of the decisions are made by technical people in the dead of night, evidently with a Ouija board or coins, flipping coins. So you get this bizarre stuff that comes into the marketplace. And even if they knew a little history, they'd realize that was tried, it didn't work. Art, for instance, did something called I'll have to tell a little on myself. I called it the piss poor controller. It was the proportional pitch controller, I think it was called. And of course, I told John Scheiken and Bridget and everybody, how's the piss poor controller doing? And they, groan, because they knew it sucked. It was really bad. It worked on the principle of force. Okay, it wasn't pressure at all, for one thing. Technically, it's force. Okay, but you press on this thing, which was like a strain gauge, and you could bend pitches this way. Well, the problem of it is the human finger can develop anywhere from a gram to about 10 pounds of force. That's a huge, unruly range. The modality for musical instruments for centuries had been length. Trombone, length. Violin, length. Guitar, length. Even trumpet, unobtrusively, when you put those valves down, is length. It's something we map to easily. Piano, I know where notes are. I know how far away they are, up here, down there. I can play without looking at it. The idea that force would be useful there was a wild and useless idea. And eventually, of course, it died a horrible death. And I made such severe, savage fun of it, just to tell them that, hey, guys, I'm not going to back up at all. That's just piss poor. That's not going to work at all. And it didn't. And again, design considerations and what we would now call ergonomics, human engineering, that kind of stuff, extremely important, and few designers know it. At one point in the 60s, it was taught to engineers, all kinds of engineers. They had design courses. I guess they got too many technical things to do that. So now you find these incredible gaffes in virtual systems, and it's like, oh my gosh, why couldn't they have done that? So I set myself up at one point and nearly starved writing manuals, which basically everybody can write a little, so why should they hire me? And that's the hard reality of it. And then the idea of ergonomics. You would have to know enough about ergonomics to know that you needed somebody that knew more about you than know about ergonomics to help you with the design of your instrument. So the industry suffers from the same things it suffered from when I was coming up, just in a different form. And now, because you have a virtual world, you can make things look like anything, you can do anything. Just the expedient. Let me just tell you one stupid idea that I should sell, and maybe somebody's done it by now, I don't know. You've got a nomenclature at some point, and you could have, if you change modes, where the nomenclature changes. Right there on the spot. It's not like, silk screening on a hardware panel, but that we were having to do. We had to make hard choices. Like a signal in, signal out. Well, why did Bob call it that? You don't know what's going to be connected. Is it to an audio controller timing input? You don't know how it's going to function as a signal. So he called it something rather vague and generic. Gosh, in a virtual world, you could call it audio in when you put the output to an audio input and control in, and in other words, there's 1,001 things like that, or a dozen, that are quite important, that the people doing modular systems now, or virtual systems, are they're caught between slavishly copying the past and not knowing about ergonomics and design considerations and stuff like that. And again, they're little tiny companies, basically. They could argue, well, we can't afford to have somebody come in and tell us about ergonomics. There's 3 guys writing this code. That's it. We're going to try to grow from there. So you get that as well. So as the French say, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Not much about Jim Scott, but hey. A friend.
Yeah. So is he really out in teaching the Navajo English?
Oh, yeah. Or somebody, one of those tribes,
Yeah, tell me about Bob. Can you remember the first time you met him?
Oh, I think I can. Well, yeah, of course I can. It's when I was doing my dissertation research, and I went up and interviewed him and found out about Eric Sadeh and Raymond Scott and Wendy Carlos. I mean, I knew of Carlos, but how to get in touch with him. He facilitated that. So I interviewed him sitting out there on the roof of the first floor, and that's the first time I met him. The first time it became apparent to me that I might get involved with the Moog Company is possibly the Atlanta NAM. They used to have them in a NAM trade show, and we talked a bit and everything, and I got the idea then, well, maybe I'd like to do that. I didn't do it right away, but he struck me as a soulful kind of person, the person that would be attractive to me, not superficial, not ponderous, pretentious, totally uninterested in his PhD and academic achievements, and living a real life without what I thought of as an authentic life, and I'm sure I stole that from somebody. Yeah, and it just struck me that would be a lot of fun maybe to do that. And I'd been 10 years in college, 4 of undergraduate and 6 of graduate, and I just didn't want to do that anymore. Maybe I was allergic to it. It was like, okay, I've done that enough. I'm going to go into business somehow. I wound up going to work for less, and then Dave Vancouvering pulled me to up there. And I will say, inauspicious, when I first started coming to Buffalo, Bob greeted me with, well, welcome to the decadent Northeast. I don't know what you're going to do but he didn't really have any idea what my value might be, and that was okay. I was reasonably young, even with a PhD earned and so forth, and I've never expected people to just open their arms and say, "Oh, well, we know who you are and what you are and what you could do." And no, you have to prove that over and over. And I guess then we got to know each other quite well from coming to each other's homes and stuff like that. I knew his first wife, Shirley, real well. That eventuated, Bob had a checkered relationship with Moog, not just Vancouvering and me. Bob Moog, the Moog of Moogs, had a checkered relationship. He left the company, and in some ways, I was there longer than he was, and it's particularly in a particular era. But eventually, he started doing design for other companies and things. And when I was not with the Moog Company at various times, I helped him. So did Jim Scott. We've spoken of Jim Scott previously. Jim, too, more as the technical, and me, I think Bob began to understand that what I said was maybe right. Maybe the guy that does the explaining to the customer ought to be there to tell the engineers, this is too complicated. We have to express this a different way. And possibly the functions are not even right for a musician, which I did get the opportunity, not when Bob was with the company, but when it was being run by Norland, to become the project chief on the Prodigy, which was the best-selling synthesizer of 19 Humpty Hump. I don't remember, 82 something. Doesn't matter. And it started as a rump project or a skunkworks thing by Rich Walburn, designed a little tiny Moog, and oh, I changed the ergonomics. It probably created a little ill will, but I felt like I knew what I was doing. The upshot is it was successful. I put in sync, oscillator sync for a junk sound, and a number of things. As a matter of fact, I wrote a little paper saying this is why I did this and that and this, why all the panel was moved around and stuff like that. So I had a number of very positive experiences. In terms of Bob, I mean, Bob was the kind of guy that, as he was in Asheville and I was in Nashville, we didn't see each other every day, but when we did, it was just like your brother, somebody that was important to you, and I felt that he reciprocated that to a large extent. Um, so we would do odd projects with each other and little design things and stuff like that when he was not with the company and when I was not with the company and things like that. And over the years, I watched his kids grow up, you know, and was there staying in his home when I would visit in Asheville, staying overnight and just becoming like a family friend in many, many ways. So he was another one of those people that simply knowing him enriched my life. Raymond Scott, Bob Moog, even Eric, who I just knew briefly, and some of my mentors, Gil Trifall, Charlie Ball at Peabody, and a number of those people. I just felt like, yeah, I have a more authentic life, a more rich life, a more interesting life because I've met these people, and just interacted with them in some sort of a way. And there were the artists, I worked with Keith Emerson, Rick Wakeman, just briefly with Miroslav Vitu. I had nothing to say to Jan Hammer. We interacted, but God, he was so, far ahead of my understanding of the wheel. Although I tried to convince him of the ribbon that was on the microphone. He was so good at the wheel, he didn't need the ribbon. The ribbon was superior. I mean, I could say, why, but it didn't matter. Jan played the other one so well. And that we've spoken earlier about this handheld portable thing. I know that Moog Custom Engineering built a mini Moog and took it all apart and had it on a swivel and, had the keyboard up here and something else over there for Jan. And then it seems that he got involved either with Roger Powell with the Probe, which was kind of a lightweight plastic thing, very modern looking, or with somebody else. And then he had that special thing. And there was the Dookie stick from George Duke, and Tom Custer started playing the Liberation, which was a Moog product. And he did all that whammy guitar, as he called it, and really was incredible playing. He would come to NAMM, Tom Custer, and play there's solo lines, that's all he was doing, but he's playing so fast that it was almost streamed into sounding almost polyphonic. And all these arpeggiated passages and everything, bends and everything. People would just draw away from all over the floor to come, what is that? What in the world is that? Electrifying. And again, hey, I'm a monophonic guy. I really believe in it. And I think when people try to do what I'm saying, make a piece where every line is a solo. Gee, isn't that what the orchestra does? Works pretty well. Works pretty damn well. Symphony orchestra. Rarely are people in there playing two notes at the same time. Again, many, many degrees of freedom. 100 people, all individually responsible for this overall. There's never really more than 4 or 5 lines in an orchestra, in the music. Rarely, unless you're doing Ligeti or somebody like that. Standard literature, you 2, 3, 5 lines, and yeah, you got this texture that's so incredible because each of those people are responsible for the detail and the nuance of this filigree that makes up this entire tapestry. So I would like people to try to make more artistic art music with synthesizers. I'm not sure that's going to happen. I'm not sure people are going to play things artistically, because the studio or the performance seems to be either or. People have skills as a performer or possibly as a composer. Rarely do they have both. And it could be that, well, this is what we get. This just incredible proliferation of various styles and sundry forms of expression, which you certainly could not get from a lot of acoustic instruments. They have idiomatic expression, as it's called, what they do well. You really have a much broader range with electric instruments because they're capable. Form doesn't follow function. To make a cymbal sound, you got to beat this brass light stuff into a certain shape. To make a clarinet, you got to have this grenadillo pear wood or rosewood or something, you know, and it's got to be shaped, and it has to have a certain form. Electronic things don't; they're not subject to that. Basically, two-edged sword gives you great freedom, and it makes you also you can do crap, you know, physical modeling. You can make the sound of a 100-mile long tube being blown by a jet engine. It's very interesting. You know, is it crap? I don't know. You could do impossible things, in other words. But you find again, about do we have infinite temporal space or infinite anything? I don't like the concept because the infinity of even numbers and odd numbers are two different infinities. It's meaningless. No, I'm much more interested that the artist would work with tools and have a cabinet of tools, not one digital audio workstation. I just don't think. It could be the future just for financial reasons. Artistically, no, I don't think so. Look at a luthier or a furniture designer. Go and look at their tools. Little gouges with different shapes on the end and everything, for making precisely this little thing here. I'd much rather that my students did a cross-platform look at tools rather than saying, well, I'm going to do, Reactor and I'm going to put everything into GarageBand or I'm going to do this. And I'm trying to teach them that, maybe the sounds that are most interesting, the little on the front is made from that instrument over there and the little over here is made from that one over there and the is from yet a third. And across these platforms, rather than designing your sounds, here's a patch on the Belchfire 8 or the Rooster Poot 9, there it is. And here's another patch, and here's another patch. Well, what does that fit, by the way? MIDI. Programs on tracks. It forces you almost to do that. It would take great discipline to say, I have designed an instrument and it takes 3 rack modules to make that instrument. How many people, again, that detail that I keep coming back to. In film, look at the crawl. Look at the number of people involved in making a film. My Lord, it's like thousands. You have roach wranglers and rat wranglers. I mean, you have people that have specialties that it's hard to even imagine, of what it takes to make a film. And yet somehow it becomes a cohesive thing, very stuck together. But that level of detail is what we appreciate, I think, as human beings. Or a stark contrast, utter simplicity. We can also appreciate. But naivete and simplicity wears a little thin. Detail has such great depth. You can simply hear it over and over again, look at it over and over again, touch it, whatever you're doing. What kind of art are you doing? We need detail. So, Bob, yeah. I wrote an article, and I'll send you the URL. It's online, and it basically said there are many people that do prototypes, but only one guy did an archetype for an industry. It was Bob, for that industry. Not only that, he wasn't such a bad businessman. He made a lot of real good decisions. He wasn't a good businessman for a corporate structure, which is where it went to. But then again, how good were those businessmen that ran it into the ground? So it's like, yeah, compared to what? Not a bad businessman. All those guys with MBAs, they didn't make it go. They had all the options in the world to make it go. They didn't make it go. And again, there were some good people there too. smart, you know. Uh, Again, it's like your life hanging by threads, how you met your intended, why you went to school where you did, you didn't get killed by getting hit by a train, and so, hanging by threads, Mars aligned with Jupiter, and so forth and so on, that you would have a great film, that you would have a great instrument, that you would have a great life, you know. And if you accept that, then you exert control where you can and with the wisdom that you can possibly muster to make a good instrument or make a great film or make a good life kind of thing. Never forgetting you're not totally in control here. You're not in charge. If things screw up, you can't be looking at the outcome all the time. You got to look at the energy that you put into it to make it go. And if you've done that, okay, that should be sufficient. I asked Hugh Kane, how would you like to be remembered? The great Canadian instrument designer, although all prototypes, he never got something like really into the marketplace, but he had genius. And I asked him, well, how would you like to be remembered? He says, oh, I would just like to be remembered as a worker in the vineyard. I think some of the men we've talked about, Jim Scott, Dave Luce, Bob Moog, David Vancouvering, any number of people, at basis, they were just so happy to be in the vineyard. They were so glad and so happy to be taking something into their life that just totally energized them, that they were just almost like happy to be there in the vineyard. You work. When you're in the vineyard, you work. That's what you do. Mm-hmm. And so I wouldn't trade my life for anybody else's. I really wouldn't. I mean, join see the world without joining the Navy and all those experiences, those nows, those things one after the other, without recourse to whether or not you're famous or rich or any of that stuff. That's why there's a basic rub where I work. It's like, well, this is sort of about being famous and being rich. When you're symphonic trumpet players, I started out, you never think you'll get women, get rich, or get famous by blowing second trumpet with a Nashville Symphony. Well, ain't in the cards. You walk through a conservatory and you ask people, are you going to get rich or famous because you're here as a musician? They'll laugh you out of the place. So, for better or for worse, if the fame and the riches come, wonderful. But if to me, if you made that your motivation, why would you do that? When I think about Bob, Luce, Scott, even Vaco, as wild-eyed as he could seem at times, they were never motivated by that. They were doing it as they went, having a life as you go. And that's why it was such a lot of fun for me, because I could witness that and I could be part of it. A lot of fun. So,